Well, welcome to the 700 Club. Thanks so much for joining with us. Democrats are opening their convention today in Chicago. They're hoping the star power from former presidents will unify the party and keep the White House.
The convention is expected to draw some very divisive protests over the support of Israel's war against Hamas. CBN's Michelle London brings us the story.
The fight for a future in America, words we can expect to hear throughout the convention as the Harris ticket works to define its policies and draw in Gen Z and rural working class voters. Political analysts say this is a pivotal week that could shape their campaign. Coming off of a busy month on the campaign trail, Vice President Kamala Harris and her running mate Tim Walz are primed for a week of events on stage of the Democratic National Convention, capping it all off with their nomination. Since President Biden stepped aside, the Harris campaign has re-energized Democratic voters, raising more than $300 million and attracting crowds topping 10,000.
This campaign, our campaign, is not just a fight against Donald Trump. Our campaign, this campaign, is a fight for the future.
It's been a whirlwind campaign. Barely 2 weeks after taking over, Harris picked Walz, the governor of Minnesota, as her choice for vice president.
When we fight,
then launching into a swing state tour where the duo voiced their vision for America's future, with abortion access a top priority.
We will pass a bill to restore reproductive freedom, and I will proudly sign it into law.
And other policies, like strengthening the Affordable Care Act, stricter gun control, and raising the minimum wage. Walz, the longtime high school teacher and football coach, looks to draw in blue-collar voters.
when unions are strong, America's strong.
It all means the race to November is tightening, with the polls revealing battleground states leaning slightly in Harris's favor. While the road to Chicago has been wide open, Democrats will face a bumpy ride at the convention over deep divisions in their party on a crucial issue.
Well, there have been real fractures within the Democratic Party on Israel.
In the primaries, Democrat members of Congress who spoke out against U.S. support for Israel's war against Hamas were defeated. Two highly visible losses: Rep. Cori Bush of Missouri and New York Congressman Jamal Bowman, who belonged to a progressive group known as the Squad. Their opponents, both strong backers of Israel. While the party fights it out inside the convention center, tens of thousands of pro-Palestinian and anti-Israel protesters are expected to gather in Chicago.
We already know that there have been plans for protests in Chicago next week. So it's definitely something that the party is going to be really trying to carefully maneuver.
Politico's Meredith McGraw predicts those loud voices will add pressure for Harris to voice a clear stance this week.
Vice President Harris is really trying to walk a fine line between not abandoning some voters and supporters who are further left, who have been calling for a ceasefire and who have been protesting the Biden administration's policies when it comes to Israel, and also defending an ally of the U.S.
One way the DNC looks to bring unity to the party: support from past leadership. The one thing McGraw says may have been missing at the Republican National Convention.
You didn't see other Republican leadership sharing the stage with Trump. It really was a message that the GOP is Trump's party now.
Former Presidents Barack Obama and Bill Clinton will headline this week's convention as the party rolls out its vision for a Harris presidency. And headlining tonight's lineup, President Biden and Hillary Clinton will address the crowd. Later in the week, Walz will officially accept the vice presidential nomination on Wednesday.
Well, our CBN News chief political analyst David Brody is with us now. So, David, how serious a problem are we going to see with anti-Israel protests in the convention?
It's going to be a spectacle, Gordon. Let's be clear. And I think the big night you'll see it will be this evening, Monday evening, and also on Thursday when Kamala Harris takes the stage. Monday, of course, tonight, Joe Biden will be speaking, and that's the reason that there'll be lots of folks in the street. What do I mean by lots of folks? 100,000 or so potentially, and things could get potentially ugly. But look, this is a concern for Democrats because ultimately this election is going to be won on the margin. And there are a lot of different groups out there that they need to win, especially Jewish voters who are a bedrock of their party. And there are some Jewish voters, especially in places like Pennsylvania and Michigan, that they're going to need to have on board. You know, the largest Jewish voting population in the country, of all the swing states at least, is Pennsylvania. 4% of all voters there are Jewish. They can't afford a drop there. And of course, they have to also hope that they have high turnout in Michigan as well, among the pro-Palestinian crowd, which they may not get as well. So there are a couple danger signs for sure.
Well, are we going to see something on the level of 1968? You know, the protest at that convention, in my opinion, sank the ticket. And then the response to it, the police response to it, didn't help either. And that was an anti-war protest. Is it at that level, or are we going to see that kind of violence?
Well, I think it remains to be seen, but I think it has the potential to be at that level. And I guess we're just going to find out in the next 24 or maybe up to 72 to 96 hours. This week we'll know. But I think it definitely has that potential. And this is the problem, because let's be honest, beyond the violence and potential for violence, that is, politically speaking, this will be disastrous for Kamala Harris and Tim Walz, because you can already see the ready-made commercials coming of this being potentially compared to 1968. And of course, you had the anti-Semitic protesters on college campuses as well. And that's why I think what you're seeing, Gordon, is if you notice, the Kamala Harris, Tim Walz folks are talking about hope and joy. They're not saying hope and change. And there's a reason for that. Of course, hope and change is Barack Obama's slogan. But beyond all of that, Kamala Harris is the vice president. So why would you want to say hope and change? Well, wait a minute. She's vice president now. Do you really want to change what she's been doing? I mean, that doesn't send the right signal. So that's why it's been called kind of a hope and joy campaign.
All right, well, let's turn to the issues. And how is Harris going to deal with the economy? She seems to be coming out, and it's kind of not going over well, that somehow or other there's price gouging at the grocery store. And personally, I find that incredible. The food industry in America has to be the most economically competitive environment on the planet. And to say that somehow or other there's price gouging, I just don't get it. So how is she going to deal with that issue?
Well, look, this is problematic for her. There's some good news. I'll get to that in a moment for her. But here's the bad news. It in essence, continues to create and solidify a narrative against her, which is this idea that she's Kamala for communism. I mean, this is what the Trump campaign is going to do. And this is another one of those Exhibit A situations that they may be able to, or they will indeed be able to employ in the fall. Look, in a way, it's kind of the good news for Kamala Harris. Richard Nixon, as you know, Gordon, tried this in the 1970s. Inflation was about 1% higher than it was now. He tried to get inflation under control. It ultimately, obviously, backfired. Inflation was rampant in the 1970s after he left office. But remember, when Richard Nixon did this, he did it in 1971 in the lead up to the 1972 election, which he won. And so there's a sense, if you're going to go apples to apples, that Kamala Harris may be doing the exact same thing. That price gouging, as it's called, or price controls, seem to be relatively successful politically with the American electorate. 75% of folks back in the 1970s, early 1970s, were okay with this. So she may be trying to do this to win an election, but the economic ramifications long-term, very potentially disastrous.
Well, I don't think Nixon ever really got blamed for it. He got blamed for a lot of things and a lot of bad things he did. But I don't think anybody really ever understood that it actually killed the economy. And then when the wage and price controls were lifted, the inflation during the Carter years was unimaginable. I mean, the interest rates got up to the federal prime rate was like 15 to 18%. I mean, it was absolutely incredible. Well, anyway, back to, I guess, Trump. Is he going to really continue these kinds of personal attacks? It just doesn't make any sense. The first time he did it on the race issue was, I'm shaking my head. What in the world are you doing? Can he stay on message?
So the short answer is yes. Well, let me start again. Yes to the first part of your question, which is he going to continue to do them? The second part of your question, the answer is no. He's not going to stop, and he's not going to be able to stay on message. I mean, he's going to try, and it'll be on prompter form, and his handlers can only hope that he reads it. Look, I mean, you know, he's going to be 60, 70, 80% focused roughly on policy. Let's just be clear on that. But I'm not quite sure if 60 to 80% is going to get it done. He's going to have to be laser focused on on policy. And that's not necessarily going to be the way he operates. It never has been, Gordon. And so here's the problem. It worked for him in 2016. You know, he was Trump. Let Trump be Trump. You know, he was different. OK, that's fine. 2020, people were not as enamored that time around. And now 2024, you get a feeling out there that there could be just an exhaustion at this point from it. And so I think that's the danger. You can try to replicate 2016, but it's been 8 years since. And I'm not quite sure if it's going to go over as well. That's why he needs to stay laser focused on policy.
Well, I don't think he's going to. And one of the things that his current line of campaigning to do a personal attack against his opponent, in my view, it just spikes his negatives and makes him unlikable. And I look at 2020, a lot of that election was, I don't want Trump to be my president anymore. We definitely heard that coming out of Georgia, people showing up to vote who hadn't voted in years on the basis I'm voting against him. So is that the dynamic in this race? Are we seeing a groundswell that's anybody but Trump?
Well, there's partly that. I mean, that's what the Kamala Harris folks are hoping for sure. I do want to not push back necessarily, but just look, here's the deal. When Trump says some of those personal attacks, so for example, he said over the weekend that he's much better looking than Kamala Harris or something along those lines. OK, well, that's a bit of his quote humor. Folks will say that gets him off message. But you got to remember, as you know, with Trump, it's about not just policy, but the show as well. I mean, people line up for days for his rallies. He speaks for 2 hours. I know a lot of people have said he rambles on and on, but he wants to give people a show. So it's always been infotainment for Trump, and that's part of it. So, you know, you kind of take it all together. Once again, I'm not quite sure if it's going to work this time because this is going to be a very, very tight election, and there can be no room for error on either side.
Well, it seems to be razor thin. You look at some of the polls. Harris has certainly surprised me how strong she is running. So tell us some key states. What are the key states to watch in the coming months?
Well, a couple things. First of all, Kamala Harris's favorability rating is up 10% since she entered the race. That's a huge jump. Look, there's so many ways to kind of dissect of how each candidate gets to 270, but let me just kind of keep it simple. There's the Rust Belt states and the Sun Belt states. There's factors either way as to how each candidate can win, but those Rust Belt states, obviously Pennsylvania, Michigan, Wisconsin, we've heard that ad nauseum. And, of course, the Sun Belt states, Arizona, Georgia, Nevada, and North Carolina. Any one of those type of combinations could potentially win it for either one. Look, I think ultimately as I look and I geek out at the map, there are a couple things that stick out to me. Number one, Pennsylvania. I think either one of those candidates has got to have Pennsylvania. Why? It's 19 electoral votes as opposed to 15 for Michigan, 10 for Wisconsin. So Pennsylvania is the big enchilada in the Rust Belt. And as it relates to the Sun Belt, look, if the Rust Belt goes south for, let's say, Trump, let's say Kamala Harris wins 2 of 3 or even 3 of 3, he's going to have to sweep the Sun Belt and probably try to win New Hampshire or something else, because I'll be honest with you, Gordon, and I've looked at this all different ways. If Kamala Harris wins all 3 states in the Rust Belt and Donald Trump sweeps the Sun Belt, in other words, those 4 states I talked about, he still comes up short. He's going to need to figure out a way. He'll be at 268. He needs to figure out a way to flip another blue state red, maybe New Hampshire. That's 4 votes. I don't know. Bottom line, Pennsylvania is the key.
All right. David, thanks for your insights. And again, you're going to have a very, very busy year.
For sure.
In other news, Secretary of State Antony Blinken held a private meeting with Benjamin Netanyahu today. The prime minister is reportedly not optimistic about a deal. Julie Stahl has a story from Jerusalem.
Secretary of State Antony Blinken is back in the Middle East for the 9th time since the start of the war in Gaza, as ceasefire talks with Hamas seem to be faltering.
This is a decisive moment, probably the best, maybe the last opportunity to get the hostages home, to get a ceasefire, and to put everyone on a better path to enduring peace and security.
Blinken met with Israeli President Isaac Herzog, who pointed out Israel is fighting on multiple fronts, including terrorism, in the last 24 hours. A 38-year-old Israeli civilian security guard, a father of 3, was killed by a Palestinian he worked with in Judea and Samaria. And there was apparently another planned attack.
Last night, we've witnessed a suspected major terror attack in Tel Aviv, which is under investigation, with a possible suicide bomber. And this morning, soldiers have been attacked in Yara. Yara is on the border with Lebanon by Hezbollah terrorists with drones.
Hezbollah continues to launch near-daily aerial attacks on northern Israel, with some 55 rockets fired on Saturday alone. And an IDF drone attack in the West Bank city of Jenin killed 2 senior Hamas operatives this weekend. In another incident, top Hamas official Osama Hamden walked out of a CNN interview when he was asked if Hamas accepts any responsibility for all the Palestinian deaths it's caused by using them as human shields. And on the problems with the ceasefire talks, Hamas is blaming Netanyahu, writing, "We place full responsibility on Netanyahu for the failure of the mediators' efforts and the failure to reach a deal." Netanyahu says Israel is conducting very complex negotiations with a murderous, uninhibited, and recalcitrant terrorist organization.
I would like to emphasize, up until now, Hamas has been completely obstinate. It did not even send a representative to the talks in Doha. Therefore, the pressure needs to be directed at Hamas and Sinwar, not the government of Israel.
If the talks to end the Gaza war fail, it may mean Iran and its proxies would launch major attacks on Israel. The New York Times reporting the Iranian government delayed strikes on Israel to give time for the ceasefire talks to succeed. Israeli forces say they're ready for such attacks.
Israel is not in the best neighborhood. We have been preparing for an attack and we are ready for anything. There are diplomatic attempts to de-escalate the situation, but we are ready for everything and anything on any front.
Israel believes Hezbollah could use failed talks as an excuse to launch rocket barrages at Tel Aviv, the Jewish nation's largest city. Julie Stahl, CBN News, Jerusalem.
I hope you pay attention to that interview that Osama Hamden did on CNN. I applaud the CNN anchor for trying to hold him to facts and hold him to his own experience. The anchor was quite experienced and quite knowledgeable about the situation. But will our State Department wake up to the ideology that Osama Hamden was clearly putting out on CNN, that none of it was their fault, that all of this is the fault of the occupiers? And no acknowledgement of the IDF in Israel withdrawing from Gaza, turning it over to the Gazans, having free elections. All of that under the Bush administration. The Bush administration believed that if democracy came to Gaza, they would elect peace. They would want to live at peace with Israel. They didn't. They elected Hamas to lead them. They elected a terror group spawned by the Muslim Brotherhood in Egypt. And you look at their charter, and it's absolutely horrific what they want to do. You look at their charter and what they view as the role for women. It is absolutely incredible that anyone on the left in Europe or the United States would say, we're behind Hamas. We want to protest what Israel is doing. Absolutely, truth has been turned upside down. I hope our leadership, and I pray our leadership, wakes up to this ideology and says, we can't negotiate with you. There's no point in it. If you continue to say Israel is completely at fault, Israel needs to be wiped off the map, every Jew in Israel needs to be killed, if that is truly what you believe, then it's time for you to end. That's what I hope our foreign policy is going to be going forward. Stop the charade of we think diplomacy, we haven't given up on diplomacy. Realize that when they're talking, they really believe that. They are holding on to it. And when you look at the history, any Palestinian leader that comes to peace with Israel, and actually any Arab leader, so Anwar Sadat, he came to peace with Israel. He was assassinated. The king of Jordan, when he made peace with Israel in 1948, he was assassinated on the Temple Mount right in front of his own son. They do it publicly. They do it repeatedly. Let's recognize the ideology for what it is. Let's stand against it because we believe in democracy. We believe in freedom. We believe that Israel is the best source of freedom for the Middle East. It's not an apartheid state. Muslims get to sit in the Knesset. There are minority groups that are protected. You look at the Christian population in Israel, it's the only place in the Middle East where the Christian population is growing. That's a government we need to get behind and stand behind. So today, let's pray for Israel. Her need is dire, and she needs to know that she has friends in the world.